chances of regret. It's where we dance forevermore, forever. Saving grace from time. We were children in our lives, better brothers than the thieves. Place to worship on our city. Our city streets. Our city streets. Better brothers than the thieves. Place to worship on our city streets. Our city. In a quiet suburban green, telling stories of the weekend's misdemeanors. And as the sun passed out, the cool and low was dark beneath the stars. The kings and queens, the future dreams, the cigarettes and broken hearts. Children in our lives, better brothers than the thieves. Place to worship on our city. Our city streets. Our city streets. Better brothers than the thieves. Place to worship on our city streets. Our city. Sitting by the trees, waiting for the rain to die down. You lost your head at the first time of asking. I was getting bored, so you had my jacket and I don't remember much. trying to scrape some money for me. You kept my secrets, I kept you company. You always said we were just good friends. We were 16, young without a reason to care. 16, my mind's your keeper. We were 16, I don't know what to say. Maybe we're better that way. I was waiting by the phone, trying to make some sense of it all. The situations build ourselves up in pretense, infallibility, cliches just to keep our heads straight. But time goes on, people change, try to slow it all down, keep me from going. I used to think we were meant to be. That was just naivety. 16, young without no reason to care. 16, my mind's your people. We were 16, I don't know what to say. Maybe we're better that way. I can't complain. Here's to thinking that we're all the same. No, I can't complain anymore. We were 16, young without a reason to care. 16, my mind said you're a keeper. We were 16, I don't know what to say. Maybe we're better that way. We used to drink bottled gins and know what how to sing. Meet the trees and untouched bar. We used to dance, we'll take a chance. I lost my mind to young romance. Yeah, I don't mind, I got it back. Half the time I'm waiting for a second chance. Half the time I'm glad I feel alright. All the while I'm grateful for my body and my soul. All the rest, yes, I'll never know. We're going down For all the dress she wore, she took my heart and such a bore. Yeah, I don't mind, I'll buy another one. Half the time I'm waiting for a second chance. Half the time I'm glad I feel alright. All the while I'm grateful for my body and my soul. All the rest I guess I'll never know. We're going down, down, down. Bottom of every broken bottle. Down, down again. We're going down, down, down. Everything's going wrong tonight. I do not know myself. 3 cheers for bad. We're going down, down, down. Bottom of every broken bottle. Down, down again. We're going down, down, down. Everything's going wrong tonight. Do not know myself. 3 cheers for bad. Bottom of every broken bottle. Down, down again. We're going down, down, down. Everything is going wrong tonight. Do not know myself. 3 cheers for bad.
Please
There
hold.
I am. There's my mic. There's my mic. It's working. Excellent. Look at me, professional. Hello, Jimmy. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Jazza. How are you?
I am not that bad. Yes, oh god, the chat's going wild, telling me that I was muted. Excellent. Thank you guys. Fixed everything now. Look at us, grown-up adult men, live streaming on the internet, like it's 2015. My name is Jazza, and I have succeeded my channel that I take quite seriously to the Right Dishonourable podcast. Obviously, as you guys know, boomer problems, Casey. How dare you? As you all know, my special, unique position is that I voted to remain in the European Union in 2016. But obviously, nobody cares about that right now. Jimmy, who are you imposturing on my channel?
We might, last 5 minutes at least before getting to Brexit. I'm obviously the representative of the 52%, as you never cease to remind me.
Yeah,
I'm here
course.
to provide a little bit of sense and sanity to your otherwise crazed musings.
That's quite rude. So I was talking about this earlier. For anybody who's listening to this, we are doing this as a live stream, and so we have a chat that's going on. Everybody, nice to meet you in the chat. Very exciting to see what everybody's got to say, and we're going to have some interaction as we go through our topics today. Something that I wanted us to kind of just address was our backgrounds, obviously. So I don't have any books. because I don't know how to read. But you can see this is my wardrobe, and then above me is don't look there because there's it's basically shit. I should use that as the underside of my bed. That looks like a sex toy, but it's actually just a camera thing, and you can just see a corner of my little cactus there. Isn't that cute? Jimmy, you have no incriminating books in your background. That is sad to me.
Well, Jazza brought this up before we started the podcast, so I've actually assembled a book collection, as most good politicians should do.
Yeah, excellent.
So you can see them here. I've got John Bew, his biography of Castlereagh. I've got The Guilty Feminist by Deborah Frances White, which is not very good. I've also got David Aronovich's book on his communist family, and I've got Posh Boys by Robert Vercake.
I'm
which
really
is really
disappointed that you don't have anything more incriminating to show us. No copies of kind of like the Communist Manifesto or anything from kind of like the Hitler years. I don't know.
No, unfortunately not. I mean, I do have the, what was it called, the terrorist cookbook somewhere in the background, but
oh, excellent.
I was too busy using it, I'm afraid. So it's got stains on it. It's not really a presentable condition.
Excellent. I'm just trying to adjust your audio at the moment. Hey, James.
Oh.
I'm very sorry about the overcorrection there. Hopefully, Jimmy is at about the right level now, because we don't want him overpowering these conversations. Everybody who's here, we meet weekly to talk about politics, current events, and social issues. Jimmy, what are we going to be talking about this week?
And I thought we'd start off with the relatively uncontroversial topic of the various Black Lives Matter protests that are going on at the moment. I'm sure you're very much looking forward to discussing this with me, Jazza.
Oh, Jimmy, you know that I love feeding into the we do two men talking about racism so well, don't we? I'll be honest, I'm nervous about talking about this because this is such a big thing, at least kind of like on my social media feeds. And I've done lots of reading to try and not sound like an idiot. And I'm sure you haven't. So we'll have a lovely time. Second up, what else are we going to be talking about?
Second up, we are going to be discussing the fact that Twitter has finally decided to start putting fact check, warnings around Donald Trump's Twitter messages, at least. No one else's, it seems, at the moment, or very few other people's. And Donald Trump has not responded warmly to this, I think it's fair to say. He's quite unhappy about the whole thing. He signed an executive order, which in theory could under law where they're not really held responsible for the content posted by their users. But we'll see what happens about that, I think. And just discuss some of the issues around the responsibility of social media networks and internet platforms to police what their users post.
Speaking of internet, your internet seems bad. So we will beautifully plow on and ignore any glitches that happen and just do our best, you know? And then finally, it wouldn't be a right dishonourable podcast and a week of something happening in an East Asian country that Jazza used to live in. I don't really know how to finish that sentence, but basically, shit's going down in Hong Kong. The Communist Party in Beijing have passed an anti-sedition law. I had to look up sedition. Jimmy, would you have had to have looked up sedition?
I can confirm I do speak English properly and didn't have to look up sedition.
There's no need to be rude, but sedition, for anybody who doesn't know, because I'm not going to be a snob about it, unlike someone, sedition is basically going against authority, rebelling against the government, all of that kind of stuff. And Hong Kong is meant to be part of the one country, two system between the self-administrating region and the Chinese mainland. And this basically removes... it has potential to remove freedom of speech and right to protest, which is something that has set Hong Kong apart, both culturally, and also has been an important part of the reason that it has been such a successful city in the past, because it kind of ran by Western ideals. Peeps aren't happy about that, and the UK has offered a route to citizenship, which is odd because we hate new people in the country generally. So that's quite. I'm reasonably happy about that, but we'll see if we actually do have something to be happy about there.
Sure. Normally at this point we would beg people for money and play some of the old band's music again, but as we already played the music, I guess we'll probably just have to plow into the first topic.
We will. Hold on.
This is what I have to listen to every week. When we're
I do
podcast.
it. We cut it out of the actual podcast, but I very often do that just while Jimmy and I are on the call, because I think it's hilarious. I don't really care if anybody else does. Thank you, Casey. Casey gave me a clap.
I'm taking that applause as applause for Jazza, but I don't really think it should be, should be encouraged in this.
Very kind. So,
well, please substitute the real music in the podcast with Jazza's version.
Thank you, Helena. You are your opinions are correct. Your take on this is sterling. I just want to remind everybody who's watching in the chat, if you have anything to say about what we are having to say, then feel free to leave a comment, and we will, at the end of each section, go through, answer some of them, maybe have a little bit of a chinwag about it. I'm excited to see what you guys have to say, because we don't have this really when we we don't have it at all when we do this, so that's going to be awesome. Right, the United States of America is literally on fire.
Bits of it.
It's
mostly not on fire, to be fair.
The majority of the United States is not on fire.
I can confirm that, I think.
So last week there was a really horrific case of a black man in Minneapolis called George Floyd being murdered by police officers by having one of the police officers kneel on his neck until he went limp and then subsequently died. Have you seen the video?
I haven't actually been able to bring myself to watch the video. I've seen stills from it, but it sounds pretty horrific. I'm guessing you have seen the video.
I have seen the video, and it is pretty horrific.
Okay.
It is. I don't know. I thought it was important to watch it because it has had such a profound effect on so many people's kind of like interpretation of this happening. Obviously, this isn't the first time, nor is it probably going to be the last time of police brutality in the United States. It's a really horrific part of that country that is kind of, it's difficult to wrap your head around, I'm sure, if you're in the country, but from abroad, it's really, really strange as well. It's so strange, I think, also to look at this kind of like American phenomenon and try and figure out where you slot into it as well. And I'm certainly aware, I don't know about your Twitter timeline and social medias, but I feel like I should slot into it somehow. Being against racism is not the same as kind of like being actively anti-racist, and I think white people have kind of like been shaken into how to be proper allies off of the back of this. But what's your experience of it been? Because obviously my social circle is a lot more liberal, flirty farty than yours is.
I think you're trying to say that you watch, you follow fewer questionable leave voting accounts than I do.
To be fair, I followed a lot of them and then have subsequently had to mute them for my own sanity.
I like the idea that you're muting them but still keeping followed.
Mm-hmm. It's polite.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have felt the same pressure. I have seen some of the messaging that people have put out, like there've been placards at the actual protest that have said white silence equals or is compliance or violence or complicity or some form of words like that. Um, I mean, personally, I don't really think that's fair. And I think that, you could obviously, it is pretty horrific how how the American police force treats black people in general. But I also feel that this is something that struck me as I was watching footage of of people in London and Manchester actually marching, is that it just seems a little bit weird for people to be marching, in anything more than solidarity. I know that you can march in solidarity, but it felt like some of the criticism was directed towards by the marchers was directed towards British policemen who have their own problems in terms of race relations, but it's a very different kettle of fish from how the American police handle things. In that sense, I think it's kind of weird, to be honest. But I suppose by comparison, the British protests are a lot more mild-mannered than the American ones.
I was really aware of and really wanted to avoid virtue signaling because I thought I had to, if that makes sense. So seeing what's happened and then feeling like I should post something or interact with what's happening in some way, shape or form, I was really aware of how much that could come across as really disingenuous. And I think that there is truth to the white silence makes you complicit in you're smirking. That's interesting. I don't get to see you smirk all of the time.
I think it's when we're recording, it's almost a constant smirk.
But I do agree that white silence is a form of kind of like it's certainly at the very least not going to break down racism, is it? But I don't think that breaking white silence on Twitter is necessarily the best way of doing it for the case of it. Actually, the breaking of kind of like white silence is taking it into places wherever you can, wherever you have, and you're going to roll your eyes again, wherever you have the privilege to be in a space and be listened to, that's where you should be having those conversations. And so it's like it's challenging unintentional but casual racism by relatives, for example, or casual comments that friends of yours say when there's no black people or people of colour around. And I don't know, I think that social media doesn't necessarily help us do that. It makes it feel like it's a one and done. I've tweeted about this. I've shared the to-do pack for white people in response to what's happened. I've donated to Black Lives Matter. There we go. I don't have to talk to my racist uncle now. Whereas actually, you really do have to talk to your racist uncle. The easiest thing you can do is chuck some money at it and say that that's that and that you've done your bit. And that doesn't mean don't chuck money at it, because obviously these organisations need money. But it's certainly not the end of what this should be. But also, that's really intimidating for white people, for a lot of white people who have never experienced oppression, let alone the kind of stresses that it must be to be a black person in the United States, just in general, walking down the street.
Sorry, well, what are you saying? It must be intimidating about being a white person in that scenario?
I don't know.
Oh. I feel I slightly lost the train of where you were going with that, but I think it can be good to do all of those things that you just described in terms of actually chatting to people within your social circle and spaces. But at the same time, I feel that saying it's complicity is actually ascribing a kind of moral weight to not doing something. That I think is kind of unhelpful and unhealthy, I should say, in terms of how politics works more generally. I think that there's a certain type of activist that thinks that you need to be active on every single issue that they care about, aside from the fact that you might not agree with them on every single one of those issues. it's just kind of an exhausting way to live your life, I think. And the fact that somebody isn't, noticeably saying something or protesting or doing, or whatever, doesn't mean that they're complicit in something. I mean, there are some people that just aren't really able to, take a Saturday off or a Sunday off and go on one of these marches, for instance. That's a very obvious way in which the slogan, I think, is incorrect, basically, and objectionable. So yeah, I mean, and also to bring it back to the point I made at the start of this is an American issue. I mean, the killing of George Floyd is something that happened in America. It's something that the average British person has no ability to influence what goes on in American policing. And I suppose it is some pressure that, like, the British media or international media more broadly do pay attention to what goes on in America, but I don't. I mean. People are going to, the Western press in general is going to pay attention to what goes on in America because it's the most important country in the West.
Also, we have the weirdness of having the shared language with America. So even though there is the proximity of language that makes it easier to kind of like put yourself in those cultural flashpoints. Like, I remember loads of British people being elated that Barack Obama was elected the first black president. That had we had nothing to do with that, guys. It's not our cultural moment, but because we can read everything about it and we can watch TV and understand everything that's going on, you can't ignore that proximity. It's like, just because of that shared language, I think that's the main thing. I will say, and I think it's important to say that even though the police brutality stuff in the US is sky high, like 100 times higher than it is in the UK, it's not a problem that we have. Like, we've got much higher incarceration rates for black and like ethnic minority people. I believe BAME boys make up 50% of the youth prison population, which is insane, seeing as they only make up about 14% of the general population, non-white people. And there are a load of cases that intersect with mental health as well, actually, of black people and people of colour being on the receiving end of police brutality in the UK as well. So, of course, you can't conflate the two because, like, it's just a completely different level in the US. But for example, there's examples of that I saw in the news today of a black guy being arrested for just standing there by the London Metropolitan Police. But I think, it does. It's just it's weird. It's strange, and it makes you wonder how you can best kind of like be useful, I guess. That's the thing that I want to do.
I mean, isn't there almost an element of narcissism, I guess, is the uncommon way of putting it, but sort of navel gazing. Again, not very nice, but do you know what I mean? Like, there is. I mean, I know when you tweet about something like that you have good intentions, because I know you're in a personal capacity, but it can come off as quite self-centered and something when someone says very grandly, I guess I'm as guilty of this as anyone who uses Twitter, their opinion on, the great matters of the day.
Yeah, literally. Jimmy, we cannot throw rocks. We have a podcast where we share our opinions.
We do have a podcast, but it is a bit like activists sometimes don't really understand the smallness, I think, of what it is they do. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't continue to do it, but I think that their actions do have to be seen in some sort of context there. I'm interested in...
I just wanted to go to the chat because there's some interesting stuff going on. So Helena made an interesting point that the pandemic itself may also force that unrealistic proximity between the US and the UK, just because people are more likely to be home and watching news around the world. And also then goes on to make a good point about the fact that police brutality, though worse in the US, isn't just a US phenomenon. But I think that like the whole shutdown thing, the fact that everybody is more likely to be on social media on their phones and watching telly probably has something to do with it. Will Collins said something as well that about the white silence thing. So white silence from non-racists, I'm going to put you in the non-racist category, Jimmy, if that's okay. Do you mind if I do that?
You can do that.
Very kind. So white silence from non-racist leaves only racist voices out there. And I think that's a good point. You kind of want to make sure that the only people that are being... you want to make sure that the only white people using their voice aren't the ones who are the worst.
We should probably shut down this podcast then. Yeah, I mean, I think those arguments do make sense. I don't think there's necessarily a responsibility for you to talk about every single issue that comes up, is all I'm saying. I think it's, people have to ration their time and their attention and all of that. And it's just unreasonable to expect everybody to condemn everything. The media provides a near endless stream of things that you could condemn. And I just don't really think it's workable. But, as someone else, Jack Randall has pointed out in the comments, these kind of things are slogans and, maybe they shouldn't be taken quite as literally as I'm taking them.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, chill out, Jimmy. Christ.
I just before we went over to the comments, I was wondering what you thought about the kind of American police response to the riots, with like the National Guard being called out and all of the other stuff that's been going on.
I saw a really articulate tweet that was like, how come America can arm its police like an army but can't equip its doctors like doctors? And I thought that was a bit of a slam dunk tweet, if I do say so.
Aren't American doctors among the best equipped in the world?
Some of them.
I thought it was more of an access issue in the US rather than a provision issue, as it were.
I hear PPE provision is also very low in the United States. There's also... Oh, It's Cow has done a fantastic quote from Randy Rainbow, who you should watch, Jimmy. He's a gay political musical enthusiast. Said that bad apples fueled by a rotten orange is the rotten orange is Trump. Do you get it?
Yes, no, I did get that.
Very good. What do you think of the mixed response to the rioting itself?
What are you referring to in particular?
The fact that they've turned from protest. There's a lot of rioting and looting alongside protests as well.
I think that's kind of inevitable once the police have very obviously lost control of a situation, then there are always people among these groups who, there's people who will loot and riot, and people who will exploit situations like this. I think it's obviously, the obvious example is I think they're in 2011, the London riots, where there was a fair bit of looting that went on. And even though the protest started out in response to the Mark Duggan killing, or the legal verdict around that, it does sort of undermine, I think, the protest, because it allows the authorities to say, to dismiss and to attack the legitimacy of the protest. So I think it's unhelpful in that sense, but it's sort of it's kind of an unfortunate side effect of situations like this, where the police have obviously lost control. So I mean, I'm sort of just looking around Twitter today. There's plenty of pretty disgraceful videos of kind of rioters' behaviour.
Oh, Jimmy, there's a YouTuber who has been videoed looting. Do you want to guess who it is? He's one of the worst ones.
One of the worst YouTubers.
Don't say me. I'll be very annoyed.
I don't know. Is it Mars Dyer?
It's not fun. It's not 2007, Jimmy. Jake Paul. There's videos of him going around and looting and like smashing up a Sephora and a Swarovski shop, which is pretty shitty because he's a multi-millionaire. Talking about the riots, and actually just as Dorothy comes in, hey Dorothy, she's got a very good video on this actually. I find it hard to kind of like condemn a riot being from a group of people who now celebrate the anniversary of a riot every year in the form of pride, like the Stonewall riots were in 1969 and were a really important part of kind of like getting LGBT, like a first step in the eventual kind of like march towards equality of LGBTQ plus people. But I have found it really, like when it comes to the rise, I just don't think it's my place to say whether it's good or bad. Do you know what I mean? Like, I can see members of the black community falling on both sides of it. There's the video, the speech that Killer Mike did, saying that asking people to stop burning down their own houses, not literally, but kind of like the metaphor there. But then there's also, like, on Twitter, Martin Luther King the Third. He
He's just tweeting no justice, no peace.
Yeah,
among
exactly.
other things. I thought your point about Stonewall was really interesting. Actually, I think there is obviously a whole thing about the legacy of historical events and how they're remembered, and it does, because there are like. Well, for instance, we celebrate Guy Fawkes Night, which was obviously an act of terrorism. But
we celebrate that the terrorists didn't overthrow the repressive rulers.
But we also,
which is a wonderful quirk of British culture.
We celebrate them being killed or being executed as well.
Yeah, and then burn effigies of people. We are a fucked up country.
Yeah. But yeah, that's kind of the thing, is that these events can get forgotten in a sense, or re-remembered in different ways long after the fact. So yeah, that is kind of interesting. But at the same time, I think you can still condemn people for behaving violently in the moment, because there are real victims of those rioters' actions.
Yeah, like Sephora. I'm joking.
Yeah, for instance.
Rowan makes actually a good point, and this is something I've been seeing a lot on my timeline today, that if the authorities can point to fringe looters to discredit a whole movement, that's on them and says something about their lack of understanding, and not the movement itself. And I think that's a really good point. There's like the vast majority of people are protesting and not being violent. But also I think like when there is that level of injustice and it's been sustained overall for like hundreds of years, I understand I don't know what I would do, because I can never understand that experience, right? But I can understand the desire to just like fuck everything and tip over the apple cart. But I also understand the desire. There was this really moving video of 3 generations of black men, and the 2 older guys being like to this 16-year-old kid, saying that doing, like, we've rioted before and it's clearly not doing anything. I understand all of the arguments, but yeah, it's a bit of a mess.
It is a bit of a mess. I mean, I think to Rowan's point, it's not so much an intellectual point; it's a public relations point. Really, is that the authorities might know that there's only a small proportion of protesters that are behaving violently, but if the net effect of that is that it's easy to portray all of the protesters behaving violently, I think that's something you should consider, basically.
So it's tactics. I don't know. I think it's a bit shitty.
I guess, but this is this is partly why you see actually protesters standing in front of shops and stopping other protesters or looters from smashing it up, because they understand the point I'm making, really, that it can make your movement look bad.
As Casey said, optics is everything just now.
Yeah, it's a much faster way of saying what I'm trying to say, basically.
Jimmy, shall we? Is there anything that you want to touch on this, or shall we move on to Twitter?
I feel there was a neat segue here about online presentation, but yeah, we can move on to Twitter. So this is the story that Twitter added a fact-checking box, or alert beneath one of Donald Trump's recent tweets. Donald Trump was basically sort of alleging that like postal ballots, which I think are more widely used in the US than they are here, will lead to his quote massive corruption fraud.
People looting letterboxes, people printing them off and doing multiple ballots and stuff like that. Loads of stuff that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is about sort of postal fraud is that it's quite hard to scale. And therefore, if you were looking to rig an election, I'm not saying it never happens it's just, it's not very practical, basically. So Twitter actually added an exclamation mark and said, find the full facts about mail-in ballots. And then provided a Twitter moment which sort of connected to various fact-checking sites and resources and that sort of thing. And it's not, this isn't something that Twitter's done very much in the past, and Twitter has been very tolerant of things that Donald Trump has said that have been somewhat less than truthful, shall we say. So I think it's a very significant moment purely for that reason. Sort of alongside this, Twitter have been doing similar fact-checking alerts in connection with kind of false coronavirus reports spread about on Twitter.
But COVID-19. Other media sites have also linked to Wikipedia pages underneath controversial topics as well in the past. So this isn't really new. It's just really pissed off the giant baby because he uses Twitter and doesn't use YouTube, I guess.
Luckily for you, he doesn't use YouTube. Otherwise, that's what we'd be discussing.
Thank God.
What's your why do you think Twitter have decided to do this now? Because this isn't. I mean, you could put a fact-checking alert beneath everything that Donald Trump has ever written on the internet. So what was special about postal fraud or postal voting fraud, I should say?
Actually, that's a very good question, and I have no idea what would have kind of like sparked this. They've probably, I would assume, been thinking about how they can incorporate something like this for a long time, and this was just the moment that it happened. I don't think this is necessarily very new.
I think that probably is the case. Yeah, I don't think the particular tweet was significant. They just decided to.
Yeah, of all of the things, postal ballots seem to be not the worst thing, not the most untrue thing that Donald Trump has said. What do you think as do you think that a platform like Twitter should be fact checking its content like this? Because for a very long time, social media platforms have used the dumb pipes kind of like defense, and there's section 230, which is a law from like the 1990s. It's pretty outdated, but it makes individual companies who host content online not liable for the content that is put up there by other users, essentially. And it has meant that a lot of social media sites have kind of like hidden behind that and been like, well, like this is what gets surfaced on the platform, with like freedom of speech and all that kind of stuff. And of all of them, Facebook is probably the one that defends its stance on that the most.
Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg came out with a statement in relation to that recently.
He did an interview on Fox News. And you know who watches Fox News?
Donald Trump.
He does, yeah, exactly.
It was him justifying why Facebook won't be arbiters of truth, is what he said. Which is, I mean, that is essentially the short version of the position you just outlined, I think.
So Facebook essentially want governments to step in and regulate them more when it comes to what is allowed on their platforms. Whereas it looks like Twitter are taking this into their own hands a little bit more. I would rather, if there were going to be any kind of like law around this, I would rather there be something centralized like I don't know, an elected government deciding how we approach this, rather than us having like a balkanized effect across all of the social media sites. But then also, as we have seen with kind of like inquiries with social media, with around social media, and we have kind of like congressmen asking Mark Zuckerberg questions, for example. The people making laws are not necessarily those that really understand the internet the best. So I don't really know.
I mean, I think you could say that about just about any area of law, to be honest. None of the subject matter experts.
Casey is continuing to really knock it out of the park with the conciseness of their comments, and says Twitter should not be allowed to censor speech that is perfectly legal. What say you?
See, I'm not really sure where I stand on this, because to get back to the whole dumb pipes argument, it seems to me that let's just stick with Twitter for the time being. But Twitter it's almost akin to like a public message board, basically. Not that people really have those anymore, but like a village message board. Although obviously anyone can see it around the globe. But they're sort of want to be treated more like a postal service, in that if somebody writes an obnoxious letter that's full of lies and sends it to somebody else, the postal service can't be blamed for that letter having been sent, even though they're the ones transporting it.
Do you think what they have done is censorship? Ian actually said a good point, that they're not censoring it, they're fact checking it.
I think the trouble will come when the trouble almost has already surfaced, in that there are some issues where the facts or the interpretation of the facts can be quite contentious, and it's not quite as easy as saying this is true and this is false. And that's actually, most of the controversial issues of our day do somewhat lie around those areas where the facts are contested. And I think that's why Twitter has been as reluctant as it has been to kind of wade into this. And I think, I don't know if it was Twitter, but one social media network had a policy that explicitly excluded the editing or the kind of reviewing of politicians' tweets, because politics is politics. The other side of that, obviously, is that Twitter and Facebook are kind of essential services in a way. They are where a lot of our debate around these things, around any sort of issues, happens right now. So it's quite difficult to treat them as private organizations. I mean, to get to Casey's point, it is slightly troubling, the idea that Twitter should be the one setting the rules for this. It does seem better in some ways to have an elected government setting the rules. But the flip side of that is that, and this is kind of the Nick Clegg Facebook argument, is we don't want to be regulated. Set the ruls.
Nick Clegg,
Sir Nick Clegg, formerly of the Liberal Democrats. He said, we want governments to set the rules, and that sort of implies that they don't trust themselves to set the rules themselves, which kind of leaves the question as to why, because most companies claim that they're ethically good and can be trusted in a variety of other ways, so why can't they be trusted to set the rules? I think the position,
I don't know, I think you're coming from from the journalism industry, where that desire to self-regulate is a lot higher. Facebook actually did the interesting step of basically, I can't remember what the group of people is called, but appointed basically a Facebook Supreme Court, which is going to guide its don't laugh at me, which is basically going to guide its
Supreme Court
guide its policy making. And I actually got taught by one of them in Taiwan, which is a little bit crazy. I don't know. I feel like there needs to be some kind of like there needs to be a truly independent body that decides on these kinds of things. But then also, can I be completely honest? There is a part of me that really pines for the internet of like 2002, where it was just the wild, wild west, and like it was an absolute mess. And obviously, loads of terrible shit went down. But part of me misses that. I don't know. I feel like a cowboy who's kind of like, they're taming the West and all of the laws are coming, and I'm like, I miss it when we all used to shoot one another. I don't know.
And sell crack cocaine via the dark web.
I mean, I only did that for one summer to get me through uni. Okay, that was it.
I think the thing is, it does sort of seem to me that Silicon Valley, for a long time, almost considered themselves above the rules, and they, were pushing back very heavily on any
Oh
kind of
yeah, there are
regulation.
loads of really awkward, outdated quotes from like the founders of Google and Yahoo and MySpace and stuff, being like, privacy doesn't exist anymore and all of that kind of stuff. And it's really interesting how society have really pushed against that.
That is, yeah, that whole thing is very interesting. I mean, I think some regulation is inevitable, and I think I'm sure we're going to get a situation where, arguably, we already have the situation where different nations have different rules, and the internet will become balkanized. The sort of dream of a universal internet will only really exist in terms of people using VPNs, which everyone should be using anyway for security reasons, but. It'll just mean that there'll be national internets. I mean, China already has its national internet, basically. And
yeah, there's a really good...
that dream's died, basically. It's over.
There's a really great book that I can't remember the author. Balkanization of the Internet. What's his name? I can't find the author. There was a book called The Balkanization of the Internet. And it really brilliantly sets out the fears of the internet being split into different, like there no longer being a World Wide Web, but it being a nation-specific web. And I've done a load of reading about it because of kind of like some of the draconian rules that the UK government has had in the past, that the Conservative Party has had in the past around trying to control specifically like porn and stuff like that. Specifically in the UK, which would have really easily just been bypassed with VPNs. But it makes the case that balkanization of the internet doesn't need to be something like a China that basically has its own intranet, but with increased legislation from localized governing bodies like the United States or the European Union, for example, with Article 17, for example. There's just going to be different rules depending on where you are on the internet, and frankly, that's going to push those who want it onto not only VPNs but also possibly kind of like the dark web and other parts where the real wild west is now.
Yeah, I think that's kind of inevitable, but on the whole, I imagine governments will prefer that option because it will look as though they've cleaned up the internet. And I guess to some degree they will have done. There'll be a public internet that is relatively clean, and then there'll be dirtier back alleys where dodgier stuff goes on.
Off of the back of what Casey has said, oh my god, the internet used to be so good. Jimmy, what is it about early 2000s internet that you miss the most?
I think there was just a kind of there was a great amateur ethos. I think the kind of DIY ethic was a lot more stronger. And I mean, if you look at kind of early YouTube and stuff, there seemed to be more emphasis on like non-professional content creators, and now all the big companies have moved in and kind of cannibalized it. And I mean,
creators and independent creators.
Yes.
This is my business hat on now. Still make up 50% of the viewership on YouTube, as opposed to companies.
Yeah, but I don't know. Well, maybe you wouldn't agree with this, but there seemed to be a time where the creators were basically the main event on YouTube, and now I don't really feel that that's the case necessarily.
Interesting.
But also, I guess you could look at podcasts. Like there was a time where podcasts were all, people like us sat up in their bedroom, and now
and the industry moved on. The industry moved on, and we didn't.
Yeah. I guess it kind of. I think I agree. I think the internet was just very fun in its early days, but there was a lot of dark shit going on there as well, and now, to some degree, that dark stuff has been curtailed.
I mean, I'm pretty sure. So the thing that I don't know if I miss it, but one of the like really pivotal things for me of the internet was, first of all, dial-up pornography. Trying to time that for when my parents were asleep, using this is the thing. Gen Zers are never gonna are never gonna know the visceral thrill of trying to watch porn on the family computer. Like, they're just never gonna understand what that was like.
That's true. That is true.
But also there was I can't even remember where these chat rooms were located, but I used to Google. Actually, I think I used Ask Jeeves rather than Google.
What a throwback!
I know, right?
Amazing.
I used to search for gay chat rooms, and I used to just experiment with flirting with other gay people. And I was very underage, so it was almost definitely illegal. But that was like a formative part of me. I don't know, I'd have probably been a vicar if I hadn't been able to kind of like cosplay as a gay person on the internet.
That leads to so many dubious questions, which I'm not going to ask.
Yeah, let's not dive into that. That's absolutely fine. Some other stuff from the chat. Will says that Will misses Yahoo Pipes. Carol Mrs. GeoCities. Free Webs websites. Friends Reunited. I never understood Friends Reunited. I was too young for Friends Reunited when it was the big thing.
Well, presumably Friends Reunited sort of doesn't really have a business model among people of our generation because everyone's on Facebook. So Will Collins actually said something interesting beforehand, which we didn't pick up on, is what do you think is the difference between the Donald Trump sort of tweet that was fact-checked and YouTube fact-checking flat earther conspiracies?
I think it's the fact that flat earther conspiracies are not generally the president of the United States.
I think it's sort of the fact that flat earther conspiracies.
Jimmy, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to say that again. You went robot on us.
So I was saying that flat earth conspiracies have no political salience. It's not kind of a live issue. So you could compare it to something like climate change, which is politically salient. There's just, I mean, I guess you could say that flat earthers are kind of causing harm to themselves and each other in their delusions, although it seems a fairly harmless belief by and large. But climate change denial has real world consequences and is an active issue politically. So is sort of more difficult to police without making Twitter look very partisan. I think if the social media platforms basically, removed all flat earth content from their platforms, it wouldn't really matter politically. I don't think there'd be a huge amount of pushback against it. I mean, within the flat earth community, I suppose there'd be, they'd be sort of saying, this is proof we're correct. They're censoring us. So maybe it would be counterproductive, but I think you could just get away with it in a way. Whereas there's some things that, you can't censor the president of the United States because he's the president of the United States. It's, it's almost recursive logic in that way.
Speaking of recursive logic, and sorry, I'm trying to do a Jimmy segue and it's not working.
So it is working like a Jimmy segue then.
Exactly. Hong Kong. So, here's a short history, Addison, for anybody who doesn't know. Hong Kong was oddly leased to the British. You don't often think about whole islands and regions being leased to countries, but colonialism.
Not all of it was leased, actually. Some of it was permanently transferred.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
We'll have to have a chat about this afterwards. But it was leased to the UK for 99 years, and there was a handover after a lot of negotiations between China and the UK in 1997. As part of the agreement, Hong Kong was to enact full democracy that had been started in the mid-90s by the British. We started pretty late there, trying to give them a democratic voice. But hey-ho, they were meant to have full democracy within 20 years. 2017 passed, and the Chinese-backed legislators in Hong Kong decided against that, which has sparked pretty much ongoing flare-ups of protests since then, since 2016 and 2017. Full handover to the Chinese mainland and we assume Communist Party rule is meant to happen in 2046. But in the face of all of these protests that have happened since 2016-17, the mainland of China, Beijing, have passed a anti-free speech and rebellion law to counter and make those types of protests and public manifestations illegal. And they've completely bypassed the Hong Kongese legislature in order to do that, which is pretty douchey.
I'm sure that's how the Hong Kongers see it.
Yeah. In response to this, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that it's not going to impact Hong Kong's rights and freedoms as an autonomous region, which is bullshit, because people are no longer going to be able to protest and say stuff against anything that threatens that threatens China's state as a state, which includes backing democracy and independence in Hong Kong, possibly. And the US and the UK and a lot of the biggest Western powers, including like Canada, Australia, etc., have condemned this move. And Pompeo, the Secretary of State for the US, has said that this now basically removes Hong Kong's status as an independent region within China, and that will change the way that the US deals with Hong Kong, which has implications for trade and finance and all of the things that make Hong Kong Hong Kong.
Is there a question?
Ask a question, Jimmy. I'm
So
the one that knows the things. You're meant to be asking the questions. Otherwise, this just turns into a monologue.
Okay. I feel like Ian Dock has actually got to the point with one of his questions, which is when the UK government handed over Hong Kong to China in 1997, full democracy was promised by 2017.
Yeah.
But what exactly is the point of that if Beijing's long-term intention is very clearly to absorb Hong Kong permanently into a singular system with mainland China in the long term?
So I think we have to, Ian asked a similar question in the chat. We have to remember that these negotiations were happening throughout the 80s, primarily. And a lot of the stuff was being put in motion in the early 90s. China was not the world superpower that it is now. I think that there actually was an assumption, and you read a lot of the diaries and the memoirs of the time, and there, I think, was a big assumption that the Chinese Communist Party would not last, because we were coming to the end of communism in Europe in the late 80s and early 90s. And I think there was a big assumption that China was going to go the same way. And so basically the agreements for the returning of the lease was just a kicking of the can down the road. That hasn't transpired, and the Chinese Communist Party is stronger than it has ever been. They have the strongest leader that they've had since Mao Zedong in Xi Jinping. And it is it kind of shows, because the UK only kind of realised what a shit deal they were striking with the Hong Kongese after the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, where there was a huge repression and a number of deaths after protests in Beijing of students. But
if that was 1989, that's still 8 years before the handover actually took place. So
it is, and basically, so a lot of the agreement had already been made. I think maybe all of it, or at least most of it. And then from 1989, there was so much concern in Hong Kong that they installed a new governor appointed by the British in Hong Kong, who then I I can't remember his name, but he was really big
Is
in
it
championing.
Chris Patton? Is that who you're
Yeah,
talking
I think
about?
so. Yeah, he was really big in championing kind of like the special culture of Hong Kong that had kind of like been westernized to a certain extent and had been democratized to a certain extent, which is why they brought in the green shoots of like starting to bring in democracy as kind of like, frankly, it was too little too late, and it was an afterthought, and we should have really had Hong Kong's back before uh, the early to mid 90s, just before we handed it over to China. And so that's why it's such a mess.
So essentially, we had an erroneous set of assumptions about how China would develop in the future, and that's what's.
I think that
landed
was
us
a big
in the
driver
mess
of it.
now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think most people, most prominent people at least seem to doubt that China is going to, adopt the kind of democratic norms that we thought they would, given their sort of opening of their markets to the world. But most people thought that political reform would follow economic reforms. Given that's the case, it now looks like China is essentially going to, convert Hong Kong into something more similar to what happens on mainland China in terms of its political setup.
It's most specifically around freedom of speech. So
Yeah.
this is why it's a really big deal, because this legislation specifically targets freedom of speech. That in itself doesn't necessarily change the economics of Hong Kong, but what does potentially change the economics and the prosperity of Hong Kong and the special status of Hong Kong, which is what made it so prosperous in the first place, is Western countries' reaction to the changing of this law, saying that it no longer is going to give Hong Kong special status when dealing with it, which affects all of the trading stuff. That's why it's such a big deal for Hong Kong, and why there are so many. I don't think I've even mentioned. There's big protests at the moment in Hong Kong.
Well, so something that I read in The Economist actually is that when Hong Kong was handed over to China, it comprised almost a fifth of China's GDP at the time, and now it only comprises a couple of percent. So economically, Hong Kong actually matters far less than it used to China.
Yeah, it's slowly kind of been strangled, and as somebody I love the Hong Kong, and it's been really sad to see it kind of even decline over the last 10 years.
I'm not sure it's like that change is not so much to do with strangulation as it is to do with the economic growth elsewhere in China.
And the opening up of places like Shanghai and Beijing as more international friendly cities to do business in, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is, Hong Kong obviously has that kind of history that makes it more, more receptive to Western interests. But it's not really obvious that China needs Hong Kong in the way that it previously did as a place for raising capital and all that sort of thing. And it's not obvious that China really feels it needs to play by the rules in the way that it used to previously. So from my point of view, I mean, this is probably the gloomiest outlook possible, but I just don't see that the West can do anything to help Hong Kong. I mean, there've been talk of sanctions and that kind of thing.
Well, Jimmy, let's talk about what the West can and may be doing in order to help Hong Kong.
Before you do that,
okay.
I don't think there's very much the West can do, and therefore I think Hong Kong ultimately is just going to be absorbed into mainland China, and that will be that.
Yeah,
I think the troubling thing about that is that long term, we're just going to have a more and more powerful China and a weaker and weaker West, relatively speaking.
If only we had a large block of some of the most powerful countries and largest economies that we could be part of to really elevate our voice.
I mean, if you look at sort of the EU's long-term prospects in terms of how much GDP it's going to account for in global terms, I don't even think, even if it could bind the EU together cohesively, I'm not sure that would help as much as you think it would. This whole thing seems to be, I mean, in many ways, the Hong Kong story seems to be the most important story going on at the moment politically. And it seems a very bad omen for the future. But you convinced me otherwise. Convinced me the West can do something to stop what's going on in Hong Kong.
So I was actually quite surprised by this, because the Conservative Party are not known for their compassion. But Dominic Raab this morning on the Andrew Marr show talked about how the UK was going to extend the possibility and a road to getting citizenship and visa rights to holders of British overseas passports. So something that happened in the run-up to the handover is that the Hong Kongese were given the option, or certain Hong Kongese were given the option to apply for a British overseas passport. That doesn't give them citizens' rights, and one of the important things about that is that that would have breached the agreement that China had with the UK with the handover of Hong Kong. But what it does give them is kind of like this third area type of citizenship and passport that essentially gives you the ability to come to the UK, live and work. I believe at the moment is for 6 months.
That's right, yeah.
With some kind of like other conditions around it. Dominic Raab announced that the UK intends to extend that 6 months to a year, and then that would possibly open up a route to citizenship once they are here for a year in the UK. So there's a couple of things about this. This is the Conservative Party essentially saying that they will take political refugees from Hong Kong if they wish, if they want them, if they want to take up that opportunity. But also, there are currently about 300,000 British overseas passport holders. May I remind you of the 100,000 net immigration figures that has plagued the Conservative Party for the last 10 years. There's also the fact that there are actually, as well as those 300,000 current passport holders, there are an estimated 2.9 people eligible.
Million people, you should say, not 2.9 people.
2.9 million people
important detail.
Are eligible for those British national overseas passports. And the UK, and Dominic Raab, it's interesting. So Dominic Raab is the son of a refugee from Eastern Europe, somewhere. I can't remember which country. That's very annoying. Yugoslavia? I don't know. I'm not going to say.
I don't think it's Yugoslavia.
And Priti Patel, the Home Secretary.
Czechoslovakia,
and that country that doesn't exist anymore. And Priti Patel is. I don't think she is a refugee herself, but her family were refugees fleeing
Kenya.
I believe in the 80s. I can't remember when that happened. Which was a similar thing where they allowed British nationals overseas to come to the UK as refugees. And they have both been criticised in the past for being part of a UK government that doesn't tend to carry its weight when it comes to taking on refugees. And there is kind of like a duplicity. I don't know. I'm in two minds. So we should have carried our weight more when it came to the Syrian refugee crisis and the Middle Eastern refugee crisis. We took 300 children, whereas Germany took 1 million individuals. That's nuts and was embarrassing. But then also,
I think the consensus is that Germany took too many people, to be honest.
I don't speak German, don't know enough German people to know that. But as an example of kind of like the disparity.
Not in Germany, but just generally speaking, I think it was probably a move that lacked some democratic legitimacy.
Sure. I'm using examples, okay? And then, but if we have an obligation to anybody, it is, I think, and as a scholar of Chinese history, I think we would have an obligation to the Hong Kongese people that we fucking let down by screwing up their handover, frankly, and feeding them to the wolves, thinking that China wasn't going to be a significant power by the time they actually needed to take over.
I think, to be fair to the British, and I'm not disputing the general your general outline of the history of the period, but I don't think the British felt that they could credibly hang on to Hong Kong at the time.
You are correct. But the fact that we thought about instilling any kind of democracy on the island literally less than a decade before the handover happened, I mean, it's a testament to what shits we were when it came to colonialism, basically. There are other... So Taiwan, it wouldn't be an Asia story if I didn't talk about Taiwan.
That's true.
Taiwan has said that Taiwan would be willing to step up as well. And I don't know. We will see. It depends how bad stuff in China gets. But there will almost inevitably be some people who are who decide to leave their home, and that's really sad. But actually, look at this, potentially a pretty good thing that Dominic Raab has done. I don't know how to feel about that.
I think the motivation behind sort of extending the offer of migration to the Hong Kongers is quite different from how the Tories feel about migration in other contexts. I mean, Hong Kong is, generally speaking, a very high skilled economy. It's not. It seems a very different. I know that they would technically be refugees, but I think what people think of when they hear the word refugee is somebody who is poor, who doesn't speak English, who doesn't necessarily have skills that would.
Yeah, but that's an incorrect perception quite often.
Sure,
most of the time, refugees, people who can afford to leave their homes, are those that are of the middle classes. People who have the money and the resources to leave somewhere like Syria and to buy a flight out of Hong Kong are going to be the higher qualified and the more educated and the more wealthy ones.
Yeah, but I also think, I mean, all of what you said is true. I just think it's a perception thing. But there is the other aspect is that there's kind of a mentality in within the Tory party that people from certain former British colonies, and these would usually be Australia and Canada and the kind of dominions, if you like, but also extends to places like Hong Kong and Singapore, where it's felt that they actually, align with British values in some way, although that's quite a nebulous term, I think, in this context, are more suitable migrants than. Did they
enjoy the 2012 Olympic opening ceremony? If they answer yes to that, then they can stay here. They align with British values. That would be my test.
I mean, it would be a much simpler test than the ones they currently provide.
Well, as you know, you've been on the receiving end of one.
I have. It's. I think it's a very different ploy for the Conservatives. I've kind of enjoyed actually how some of the free market think tanks have taken this idea and run with it a little bit. There was an article posted on CapX, which is like a free market neoliberal type of blog, I suppose you would say, where I actually suggested that the UK set up a free city, potentially, near somewhere like Lincoln, and actually have all of the Hong Kongers migrate over there and sort of have low regulation and all that kind of thing. This
why
free
near
market
Lincoln?
I think because it was identified as. I don't know if Lincoln was mentioned in the actual CapX blog, but I think it was identified as an area that is sort of big enough and is near a coast and could potentially take advantage of an old dock, and there were various other things like that.
Are they thinking that they're just going to transplant Hong Kong? There needs to be a dock. There must be at least one dim sum restaurant open on a Sunday.
I mean, does Hong Kong do they do much with like containers? I know Singapore has like the largest container dock in the world or something.
I am not sure.
Not sure. I don't know why the dock was mentioned.
But that is interesting because Hong Kong is a formula that was copied by mainland China with a lot of other cities as a special economic zone, and so was incubated, liberalised a lot quicker, and so attracted new businesses, international trade, etc., etc. But also, like, for once, liberal economists, this isn't about you at the moment. Let's not, like...
Well, if you've only got one issue, and you tend to see the world through that prism, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it just made me laugh. Something else funny that came up in relation to the story, and try to end on a slightly more light-hearted note here, but is that British civil servants in a memo actually discussed the possibility of moving Hong Kong to Northern Ireland prior to the handover in 1997.
Moving it to what?
Well, moving all of the residents, all of the Hong Kongers over to Northern Ireland. I don't think it wasn't seriously discussed, but there is a memo somewhere, and it was released as part of like the 30-year kind of release restrictions.
I love how batshit crazy that is. I wonder what that would have done to the Northern Ireland peace process.
Yeah, that is mentioned in the memo. I think it was hoped that the sudden arrival of millions of outsiders would force the Catholics, the Protestants, to recognise the similarities between.
I get it. Like impose some racism.
There's nothing that unites white people more than having
oh my god,
non-white group
we've gone full circle with our topics. Well done.
Yeah.
Guys, that's pretty much it. We'll give you a few a little bit to ask any questions if you have them. Jimmy, in the meantime, where can they find you on the internet if this is their first time seeing you, you lovely man?
They can find me at JDE Nichols on Twitter. That's the only place. I'm available nowhere else.
No Instagram? You're not showing off those beautiful flowing locks on the gram?
No, unfortunately not.
That's sad. Oh well.
There's too much competition in terms of flow locks on Instagram.
And you can find me on all. Well, you're on my channel, so.
I think they have found you actually.
You reached it. You found me. Anymore. Yeah, exactly. Thank you for watching the Right Dishonourable podcast. Only as truthful as resources permit. Merch. Can people still buy this?
I still do have some. If there was a sudden influx of interest, I suppose I could get more made.
Let us know in the comments if you'd be up for merch. I feel like I'm Jake Paul now. A. James said, I feel like I've been at parents' evening with my two lovely dads. Thank you.
I think that's a compliment, possibly.
Just take it as a compliment.
I think it was intended as such. I feel like lovely mugs may not be referring to the crockery, possibly. I'm sure.
Oh, Mary, that's very clever. So shall we go now?
Oh wait, I feel we should answer one or two of these questions. Alexander Wood has asked what we think about the Labour whip resignation, which is Rosie Duffield. Have you followed this story?
It's another sex scandal, isn't it?
I think she was seen walking with her lover during the period where she was not supposed to be seeing anyone from outside her household.
See, this is one of the things. Lover for me just reminds me of what gay people used to call their partners. And so it's kind of like a secret clandestine, like, oh, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, my lover. I find that really odd, actually. Yeah, she should have resigned. Isn't it nice that Labour now have an example of someone resigning who should have resigned?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I kind of feel like what she did was not really a big deal. I don't think there was any suggestion. I might be wrong about this, but I don't think there was a suggestion that she'd actually touched her lover during this period. I don't think they'd broken social distancing, to put it that way. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, I think she'd been tweeting criticism of Dominic Cummings before this story emerged. So very difficult not to look like a hypocritical dick in this scenario without resigning. I mean, I suppose she still is a hypocritical dick. But there you go. She's paid the penalty for that. Ian Doc actually asked earlier on, this is one for you, Jazza, whether the UK's plan after handing over Hong Kong was that Taiwan would end up in charge of the mainland again.
God. Are we going to go into like Taiwan, mainland, China, like
I think
politics
the short answer is no.
No, I think maybe.
Is the answer yes?
Yeah, I think that because they're the nationalist government, and the nut job Kuomintang, they still see themselves as the legitimate government of China. And like that's why Taiwan's official name is Republic of China, because they're the guys that lost the Civil War and then fled to Taiwan. That would not surprise me. And in a similar way that we expect, if there is a reunification of North Korea and South Korea, that Seoul would kind of like take over. I think there would be an assumption. Maybe there was an assumption. I don't know. I haven't read that many memos. But they probably thought that if the Chinese Communist Party fell, there is at least a nationalist government in Taiwan that is ready to take over.
There you go. Well, that's a pretty thorough answer.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I think that's all the questions we have. So I think we can wrap this up.
Excellent. Okay, we can go now.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us on this live stream, and we'll try and do another one at some point.
Sure, maybe. Okay, bye.
Bye.